So thanks, Holly, for joining us this morning. So you are assistant professor at TU Delft at the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering, and you are specialized in textiles. So zero waste fashion and new forms of sustainable textile technology like multimorphic textiles or new 2D or 3D woven structures, which I have no idea what it is. So I'm curious about what you're gonna tell us about.
Sure.
So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak about my research today. What I'll be doing is giving a sort of a slightly expanded version of a paper that I'm presenting in a couple of weeks at CHI, which is the Human Computer Interaction Conference, which is held every year. This year it's at Hamburg. So I'm just going to be talking through that, but I'm going to expand on it a little bit just because I think you'll be interested more in the sort of the wider context a little bit. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this works properly.
Yeah, we see.
Yeah, is that all right? I just need to make sure I can see my notes. Okay, so the title of this presentation is Conformal, Seamless, Sustainable, Multimorphic Textile Forms as a Material-Driven Approach for Design and HCI. The original paper didn't have the design and part, it just said for HCI, so that's how I'm expanding it. The paper was written by myself and Professor Alvin Karana, and so together we developed some of these ideas at the sort of the intersection between her research, which is very much about material-driven design approaches, and mine, where I was trying to we're trying to introduce this notion of sort of an expanded idea of temporality across not just material product sort of levels, but right into how things are produced and use time and wider sort of ecological time, sustainability, circularity, that kind of thing. So it kind of comes from, for me, a starting point of the unsustainability of the textile industry. I don't know how much you guys know about this. I know it's most people are aware that things like sweatshops and fast fashion are bad, and we should try to not engage with it if we possibly can. But I think it's a really complex set of concerns. So the majority of the garments that we have around us, that we see, that we accept as ordinary and correct or evaluate as good, they look the way they do and they function the way they do because of this kind of complex interaction of social, cultural, economic and technological factors. So in the industry, everything from how yarns are spun, how looms are designed, the technical requirements for the cutting of fabric, how we divide all the tasks that make a garment into lots of tiny little steps in order to enable mass production. Things like this sort of expectation that the industry has that we can just extract vast quantities of raw material and emit vast quantities of waste, whether that's textile waste, so like materials, or whether it's CO2 emissions. So all of these things build up to a product that we look at like a pair of jeans and we go, that's just like an ordinary pair of jeans. But it's the result of these fundamentally unsustainable practices and ways of making. So we have this situation where ordinary citizens and the industry itself, the way that they evaluate a textile or a garment's performance and its aesthetics, how it feels, are based on its technological development, which was focused on uniformity, ease of production, speed of production, low cost production. So this decades, 100, 200 years of building and then operating within this deeply problematic paradigm. And it's created this landscape and regime with a set of processes and expectations that seem really difficult to deviate from. We don't really want, like a lot of people want to be able to replace, you know, these bad products with good ones that look and function exactly the same. But what I'm trying to say is that that's perhaps not possible. You know, the textile and fashion industry has done a lot to try and sort of ameliorate this, you know, whether it's increasing efficiency, replacement of problematic materials. You know, increasingly we see policy levers imposed on the fashion and textile industry in order to try and force it to kind of comply. But really what it comes down to is this systemic overproduction of fibre, yarn, textiles and garments in the industry that's contributing to all of this. So all of the good things that we've done in terms of efficiency, in terms of replacement of problematic materials is then undone by the scale of production. So that's the kind of the background for it. And then in HCI, so in human computer interaction, you know, therefore that has the sustainability problem as well. So we have in HCI scholars looking at how to integrate sustainable ways of thinking into these design of systems and objects that facilitate, you know, interaction between us and technology. But it's been very human-centric and it's been very much critiqued. And there's this big gap, just like in the rest of sustainability, the rest of the world, we have this gap between theory and practices in sustainability, and particularly in HCI. And one of the things that we are interested in doing in this paper is seeing how we can use material-driven approaches in this context to try and help address this gap, because in HCI textiles, which is very much a material-driven, you know, practice, we have a clear intersection between these problems. So, sorry, there's someone speaking. I think that's all. Okay. So in HCI, they do all these really interesting things with textiles. They develop these sort of interactive, deeply sort of provocative and often very beautiful textile outcomes. And so if we look at the discourse, we see the sort of drive to make textile knowledge more accessible, because often people who work in human-computer interaction know nothing about textiles. So they don't know how to design a textile, they don't know the difference between what's woven and knitted. And so there's this big push to sort of make knowledge about textiles and as a system, how to make it more accessible. There's also a lot of interest in these sort of physical but also digital tools. You know, how can we develop software that enables the more efficient, you know, design of a textile for interaction. So here's this example here is for 3D knitting. It kind of maps directly off a 3D object and then can translate it into a 3D knitted object. There's also a lot of examples where they use a textile as a substrate for sort of active materials. So they take an existing textile and they'll overlay a technology onto it. And so sometimes that is like a biological active material, like in the Rivera case, or in the Posh and Kovac example, it's the more kind of classic e-textiles. So we've got these conductive yarns, we have these computer components that are then integrated or applied onto a textile as a substrate. And we also have examples where they've been used as, you know, to make complex 3D form. So there's examples of like a denim jacket that's got conductive yarn woven into the twill structure in the sleeve, and you can use it to control an app on your iPhone, for example. But these kinds of things, what they do is they actually risk compounding the unsustainability of disposable technology with all the problems that the textile industry already has, because the HCI textiles community doesn't address sustainability in a very explicit way. They do some things like suggest that we could make it modular, so you can remove these electronic components, or you do design for disassembly so that you can sort of separate the conductive yarn that's embedded into the textile from the rest of it. But neither of these address the inherent unsustainability of existing production systems or supply chains. There's also this sort of problem with a lot of e-textiles where they seem very gimmicky, or like they don't feel natural to us, like they're like there's this kind of clear added component to it. And so in terms of usability, user acceptance in HCI textiles, they've been trying to move further and further towards more deeply embedding the technology into the textile material. And so while like a material-driven approach that is often done in HCI textiles, where you kind of tinker with the material and you're kind of tuning its qualities, that can make it very relevant to our daily lives. The problem is that the more we embed some of these materials, the more problematic things like circularity will become. So if it's deeply integrated into the textile structure so that we accept it more as a textile object that is augmented somehow by technology, it's much, much more difficult to remove it from that textile at the end of its life. So it becomes more desirable. Maybe people want to buy it more, they want to own it, but it's a worse product because we can't separate those things out. So the other thing that's like this sort of idea of deeply embedding things is that there's a tendency to treat the textile as a surface, as a substrate. And so they're kind of dealing with textile and form as very separate components. And so the HCI textiles really want this sort of seamless experience and this deeply embedded thing, but then they're kind of limiting themselves in terms of the types of interactive experiences or sort of performative or multi-situated material experiences that could be possible. So this is really interesting for me anyway, tension between wanting embeddedness, wanting the sort of seamless, natural textile experience, and some of the kind of materials and processes and techniques that don't really align with that, and very little consideration overall in terms of sustainability altogether. So the key question for me is, how do we achieve conformal and seamless experiences in HCI textiles, but that are also sustainable? So how do we kind of have it all, essentially? So the way that textiles and objects are conventionally made is they're kind of roughly divided into two parts. So a textile is constructed, built from fibre, spun into yarn, made into a textile, a weave or a knit or a non-woven, and then it's a fabric on a roll. And that's one kind of quite separate part of the textile and fashion industry. And then the form is designed, usually not in consideration with the design of the textile. Often the textile is ordered based on what is needed for that design. The form is designed, the pattern is cut from the 2D fabric, and then it is sewn into a 3D object using manual labor. There's a little bit of research going into like robotics, that kind of thing, but it's primarily done by people working at a machine. To make a pair of jeans might be 20 people, 20 pairs of hands. And then in terms of use, the fashion industry also doesn't really care how people use their garments. Like the way that they validate if a design is successful is if it sells a lot. It's not really about how people actually use these things. So from this whole kind of way of dividing textiles and form production. We have inefficiencies, overproduction, dissatisfaction. People throw away vast quantities of textiles and textile-based objects. So textile form, which is a key part of my research, is where textile and form are simultaneously constructed by the sort of interlacement or deposition of matter, fibre and yarn. So there's no separation between the making of the textile and the making of the form. They are the same kind of processes. It eliminates much of the manual labour in garment production, and it also can enable localised and affordable garment production. It's basically turning textile form production into an additive manufacturing process rather than the subtractive one that it is at the moment. And then the multimorphic part of the multimorphic textile form, that refers to change over time. So across material, social and ecological scales, considering everything from material and form relations to production processes, people, how they use things, the kind of experiences they want and they can get out of a textile-based object, but also ecosystems from a holistic perspective. So it's sort of this bridge between theoretical roots of material-driven design and making and sustainability with an emphasis on temporality and change over time. So multimorphic textile forms are textile-based objects that are designed through simultaneous thinking of material, or textile in this case, and form, which could be any textile-based object or product, that change either in the design and production time and or use time. And it's in order to extend life cycles for on-demand local production and also zero waste. So in the paper, we looked at a range of cases from the HCI literature to see what has been done in terms of these examples of textile forms, and then sort of grouped them in a bunch of ways. So we ended up with 18 good, clearly defined examples, and 10 of these categorized as sort of static forms of textile form methods. So they're knitted or 3D printed or molded or woven or grown textile-based objects. And then there were 8 morphic textile forms, which take temporality as a design element during their design and or use time. And then 2 of these take a holistic approach to sustainability. So out of all of the cases, only 2 like explicitly address some aspect of sustainability. So the key motivation and development of textile forms is moving towards zero waste and conformal textile-based objects. So it's not subtractive, it's an additive way of making garments. And the kind of the key thing out of it for me is the degree to which it disrupts the textile and fashion supply chains. So essentially it means that a fabric mill could become a garment maker. And so it kind of cuts out a large section of the supply chain, which is a good and a bad thing, depending on who you ask. The best known examples of a textile form method that you've probably seen everywhere is 3D knitting or whole garment knitting, where the 3D form of a knitted object emerges directly from a knitting machine, and there's no waste or very little waste, and there's very little post-knitting processing required. But there are other methods, so things like we can 3D mold a textile-based object, we can 3D weave a textile-based object, we can 3D print, and we can also grow textiles in the context of biodesign. My research mostly has been looking at woven textile forms. This is an image from my PhD from a few years ago, this very simplified schematic of how that sort of process works, using existing jacquard looms in order to, and just changing the design process for them so that we can make 3D woven textile-based objects directly on the loom. So here's an example of what that can look like. So this is 3D woven zero waste trouser. This was developed over about 3 years. First, the design methods that I worked on in my PhD, and then applying it in an industrial weaving context that you can see in the second image. And it results in a 4-layer trouser woven directly on the loom that requires the zipper to be inserted, and that's it. So you sew in a zipper and then the trouser is complete. So they've come off the loom almost fully formed. And often with these kinds of methods, questions arise relating to scalability. People want to know if it's expensive. You know, is this something that only works for like couture products or something? And other things like, will it put large sections of the world's workforce out of employment? You know, it's one of the largest employers in the world. Does it mean that garment workers in Bangladesh are going to become unemployed? And these are open questions, and it's part of ongoing research. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this process is, you know, if we think about the way that design can de-future possibilities, we can kind of use that. So one of the problematic elements of the fashion and textile industry is the scale of mass production and overproduction that we see. And with 3D weaving, you actually can't mass produce in the same way. So on the right-hand side, you see an image of an industrial cutting of garments where they lay multiple layers of textile and then cut the pattern out all at the same time. They might be cutting 100 of the exact same piece simultaneously. You literally cannot do this with 3D woven garments. And so it is inherently not able to be mass produced in this way. So it's de-futuring scalability and futuring degrowth, which I think is really challenging for the industry. So morphic textile forms take textile forms and add an element of temporality to it. And so this could be like change in use time, a change that occurs over the design and production time, or a change that occurs in both of these things. So as an example, this one enables change in both design, production, and use time. It's a zero-waste 3D woven trouser, which was actually developed from the previous example that you saw. It uses a cotton warp, so the vertical direction of the woven textile is defined by the loom, and it was a cotton. And then in the weft, which we can choose and add whatever we like when we do that, it is a combination of cotton, but also a polyester-based heat reactive yarn. And it embeds change in form and shape into its materiality, which means it can be shaped on a mold for production. Like you can see in this first video, it's placed on a 3D mold, and then you apply heat and it will shrink to it. The mold acts like a resist. So that enables sort of production flexibility, but it can also be very easily shaped by the user. So when they get this product, they can mold it to their own body for a specific fit or any aesthetic requirements that they may have. So the first, this is how it comes off the loom. This is after it's been shrunk on a mold, and this is the exact same trouser when it's been shrunk to 100% of its capacity to change shape. But we just throw it in the dryer. So this example, it's a hybrid between polyester and cotton fibers. So it demonstrates that while such textile forms embed many positive environmental processes and really kind of interesting user experiences, it's also possible to develop a textile form that is unsustainable. You know, combining polyester and cotton, there's research being done that enables us to recycle those maybe sometime in the future, but at the moment it's not commercially available. The infrastructure that we have to enable recycling of these hybrid materials just isn't there, and the vast majority of the textiles that and textile-based objects that we wear and own are hybrid materials. So this is not a holistically sustainable example. So multimorphic textile forms is taking the textile form, adding temporality, but expanding it into ecology. And so here's an example of a project of mine, which was trying to also consider ecological time in that. So it did that by making it a monomaterial. So the design, this is showing change in design, kind of simulating what happens as those textiles change shape in order to develop the design itself. It was for a film, a speculative film called Planet City, which imagined that if every single inhabitant on the Earth was placed into one city and everything that we needed to produce and use and eat and like everything that we needed was produced in that one city, and we left the rest of the world to rewild. And so conceptually, this was remining polyester from late capitalism in order to use it in these sort of celebratory costumes for a festival that occurred in the film. So sustainability in these ones is addressed in a number of ways. So we've got simultaneous production of textile form to enable on-demand production and automation. It's also zero waste. Uses 100% polyester, so it's a monomaterial. One of those has heat react properties and the other doesn't. And the interaction between those structures and woven and the embedded woven form creates these kind of variable zones of shape change. And it can be easily recycled at the end of its life because it is a monomaterial. So you can see here the application of heat and what it does. The activation is really simple and can be done personally by somebody. These costumes, when they were designed, we didn't know who was going to be wearing them. We didn't know whether they were male or female or what size they were, but we could send these over to to the director and the costume director, and they could fit them to their user, to their performer at the time. Those are these quite crazy costumes that we made. This is a still from the scene. So multimorphic textile form thinking, what we propose is that it can aid HCI designers and designers in general to synergistically build behaviour throughout the textile system via materials and extending beyond use and interaction, which is usually the focus for HCI, and into ecological time. Enables localized, variable and tunable material experiences, which can be seamlessly embedded via the material, its textile structure and its form by design. It enables, we need to broaden the range of morphic materials and mechanisms that are available for textile forms, because as we develop new morphic materials, there will be new means of production available to us. And so this, if we can sort of simultaneously develop these two things together, then we will be able to take advantage of these material properties as a means of developing new design processes and production processes. And we'll end up with things that are sustainably produced, and could be even things like living textiles, for example, which would provide us with radically different functions and user experiences. But in order to do this, textile knowledge within HCI, but also within the fashion industry and the textile industry, needs to be further developed and deepened. Lots of collaborations need to be built and undertaken. We need to have a very critical approach to the diversification of textile-based form production methods that are used within the industry and within HCI itself. We need lots of new tools that support the visualization and evaluation of textile forms that can change at different scales over time. And one of the really interesting things about the HCI community is the way that they evaluate these interactive textiles. They compare them to like a screen or a mouse or a trackpad. They compare them to things that aren't textiles. They compare them to hard materials. And then they say, well, it's not reliable enough, therefore I need to harden it or stiffen it or put this reliable technology on it. So overlaying a predictable technology on a textile substrate can solve the sort of imperfection that textiles have, but it diminishes the kind of the reason why we chose textiles in the first place. You know, they're malleable, they're these kind of complex things. They're soft and we wear them and we want to interact with them in very particular long-standing ways. So to fully utilize the potential of textiles in HCI, these interactive, rich experiences that textiles can bring, we need to be quite critical of how we evaluate these interfaces and celebrate them more for the properties that we choose textiles for. And within HCI, there's this very human-centric technology will save us sort of mentality that that is super interesting. And sustainability is very complex, and it's very easy for humans to be sort of seduced by their own brilliance, to feel like, oh, I've made this technology work, I've made this interactive interface, it does this amazing thing, isn't this great? And they don't want to make it work less in to function less like the way that they intended, just for sustainability reasons. Like there's this sort of trade-off that in HCI anyway, the environment doesn't win. And it doesn't tend to kind of come out on top in that. So what we need is non-anthropocentric design methodologies that forefront sustainability to guide HCI designers toward a sort of more holistic and multimorphic view of these things. So future work, lots of dissemination of knowledge about textile form design and production. We need to use design to lead the development of new materials and mechanisms, digital tools to evaluate and visualize design methodologies, and also comparative LCAs, supply chain system analysis, infrastructure development, prototyping of this infrastructure as well. And so that's a bit of an overview. So if you're interested in reading the paper, you can access it on my website. There's a preprint available, and a bunch of other publications related to it. Or you can send me an email if you're interested in having a chat. Thanks. I went over time a little bit. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's perfect. No worries. Thank you, Holly. Thank you very much. I guess, yeah, floor is open for questions.
Clapping emoji.
There is a question from Boriana.
Oh, hi, Boriana.
Hi, Holly. Thanks a lot for the very interesting presentation.
Yeah, no.
So very exciting also to see the pictures, because we discussed it before, but now it was really visual.
Yeah.
So two questions. One, you can already guess. What could be the link that you could imagine with digital product passports? So that's one. And the other one, I was really triggered about your comments about additive manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
We are discussing it in very different contexts, like if you have, for example, a car component, that it could be actually remanufactured with 3D printing and that it could be returned. And now you also mentioned this additive manufacturing in your presentation. So if you could reflect on the potential of this additive manufacturing in a broader sense, and what it would require to bring it in.
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
thanks.
So in terms of your first question, product passports, I think it has a really interesting, sort of poses an interesting conundrum, because it fundamentally shortens the supply chain. Like it kind of takes a chunk out of this very fragmented textile fashion industry supply chain, which is notoriously complex and complicated and global. And so it kind of, I think in a way it would simplify the information, the number of steps would be sort of reduced. But at the same time, I think it's still really, really important. I think digital passports for products is a really important factor. I think, and we've talked about this before, I think there's a real need for all of that information to be real time and enable designers to make decisions as they're doing things. Because at the moment, even for me, when I did my PhD, for example, I wasn't able to use a tool to give me a comparative LCA. It's like, is this actually any better? And so designers are simultaneously told that you cause 80% of the problem, like 80% of the environmental impact of a garment, for example, or of a product is determined at the design phase. So they're given this responsibility, but there aren't enough tools to support designers to actually make the right decisions as they're designing. And so they're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I think like maybe a broadened idea of what a digital passport is. It's not just a record of what it is, but one that gives back, like that's like real time, back and forward, iterative, like a design process is. It's never linear, even in the most kind of strict, product development sense. It's never linear. And so having something that enables you to make the right choice is super important, regardless of whether it's in like the process that I just described or a regular, fashion textile industry thing. What was the other question? Additive manufacturing.
Maybe, sorry to interrupt you,
Sure.
because I really like this, let's say, this discussion on the product passports. I also want to ask you, do you see like, I mean, as a kind of tool for regaining control? I mean, the combination product passport design and the gaining control of the textiles, because I mean, I just referred to a recent report. So what you see now with textiles is that you lose control. And there was this Kenyan report that every party in the chain might do the right things, right? The charities are collecting the clothes, then they are transporting them to Africa, then they go there and then it's oversupply, and then they end up burning for cooking. So this circularity, the notion of control, if one thing goes wrong, it doesn't matter how many investments, how much money you spend to really be in control of one part, it crosses border, it gets somewhere else, you lose control.
Yeah.
And this whole, I mean, governments are trying to gain control, but the question is, can something like designers or brands or whatever to regain this control, because very little is needed to have this basically effect that as if nothing happened before.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I mean that's always a big motivation for me for changing the way things are designed and made, because it ties into relocalizing production, enabling us to do things that are on demand, that are inherently designed from the outset so that they can be recycled not just once, but again and again and again. And I think those things in combination enable like a degree of control, because you're reducing production volumes inherent, like you like that is kind of the main problem, is that the volume in terms of fashion and textiles is just so vast, and it's such a there's a lot of informal networks within it. Like there's a lot of very unstructured ways that textiles and garments and waste is processed. I had a master's student who did her thesis looking at the textile recycling of cotton in India. And we spoke to a range of different stakeholders, went over there for a couple of weeks, and there was no established system or way of knowing what goes where, who gets what. Like if you sell something, where does it go? How's it? Like nothing at all. And it's this vast quantity of textiles that a lot of them just end up in waterways or in landfill. And the factories don't even know. They think they're selling it to someone who's going to use it, but then if they can't make money off it, then they will just throw it away. So there's like, I don't know, that comes back for me to the scale of production, the scale of consumption. And I also think, during my PhD, originally I was doing a zero waste design for the conventional fashion industry for cut and sew. And one of the things that came up early on in that was that if I worked with a really big sustainable outdoor brand to redevelop an existing design so that it used less material, so I can reduce its material consumption significantly, they were like, well, that's great, but now we have to order less fabric from our fabric supplier. And our fabric supplier will freak out if they get a lower order from us, and then they would have to order less yarn, and then they would order less fiber from the fiber producer, which is good because that's less materials we're extracting from the environment, which is what we need. And so the brand that I was working with said, well, then we need to either compensate our fabric supplier so pay them the same amount for less material, or they need to increase the number of garments they make. So they use the same amount of material, but they make more products. And that's what they did. But what that does is it takes the problem out of this quite controlled, more controlled industry context, the waste that was in a factory and they knew where it came from. And now it's in the hands of consumers and it's lost. Like, and it puts the problem onto municipalities, it puts the problem onto, you know, Ghana or, you know, all these places where we dump everything. And so it kind of translates this problem. So in a way, efficiency has made the problem worse. So efficiency in production, where we reduce waste, the business model, the economic system just means that it makes more sense to increase the amount that we produce if we've saved on material at one end, rather than actually addressing the problem, which is overconsumption, overproduction, those sorts of things. So yeah, I think that's a rambling answer to your question, but anyway.
Thanks, very interesting. I mean, the second question, we could maybe take it offline because maybe there are some other people that want to ask.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question? I have some questions that are much simpler, I think, because my knowledge on textile is quite limited. But yeah, you are talking about all these new technologies and the future. You gave us a look into what textile could become and how it could be made. But I was wondering, well, we're not there yet, and there are different options to explore to limit ecological impact. Like you mentioned, new materials, maybe new business models like lease. Like now you can lease a jeans, pair of jeans somewhere. The process, but yeah, where do you think is the biggest chance to reach the goals that are set for 2030?
I mean, I don't think there's a single thing, like one thing at all that will solve anything. I think it's a very complex problem which will require lots of different solutions. However, we do know that anywhere between 75 and 83% of a garment's environmental impact is when it's produced. So when we make the garment, not when we wash it. So not the use phase, but when it's made, how it's dyed or washed, or the amount of energy used to make the fabric or spin it, or whatever, transport, all that sort of stuff relating to production is the vast majority of its impact. And so one of the easiest things to do to halve that is to double the life of a garment. So any garment you have, to do things like leasing, for example, or sharing garments between you and your friends, or models that enable us to extend their life, or repair services, designing the product so that it lasts a long time, is able to be repaired in the first place, those sorts of things. But so that's often sort of presented as, you know, there are a lot of companies, fashion companies, for example, that are now taking back people's unwanted garments, refreshing them and reselling them to the next consumer, which is great. But what those companies don't like to sort of acknowledge is that while on a per garment basis, we can halve its impact by doubling its life, they're on a industry at a bigger context that only applies if we halve production and consumption. Otherwise, it doesn't have that actual impact. The way the industry currently communicates about its improvements is on a per garment basis. But that doesn't tell us the reality, which is that on a per garment basis, we're doing better, but we're increased production. And so the total impact is increasing dramatically because of this scale of production. So I think in terms of meeting the goals of 2030, I think it's going to be really tough. I think it has to be legislation-led at this stage. I really don't see the industry seriously addressing these things without, a bit of a carrot stick situation. But yeah, there needs to be a lot of research and development to support those things. For example, there's a lot of talk in textiles in the Netherlands to introduce requirements for a certain percentage of recycled content in all the textiles and textile products that are sold here. But we don't have the infrastructure to support that at the moment. And so without the kind of corresponding support for those sorts of new laws or policy changes or that kind of thing, then the companies are just stuck because they don't have the capacity, the ability to actually do what's needed. But without that drive or the stick from policy, the industry just won't do anything. So I think it's a really tricky space. I don't know what the best thing to do is.
Is there also research done? I have no idea about, because nowadays you see big signs with let's buy your t-shirt, it's recycled polyester and super great. But well, I'm on the plastic side, and I know how many fibers are washed away when we wash something and it's not filtered out. Yeah. How is it for recycled materials? Is there any research done about, actually, because nowadays we want everything recycled, well, it's very good. But I mean, most of plastics, they are actually downcycled, and even if it ends up in your garden as a bench, it also degrades under UVs, and it's not very good. Yeah. Microplastics or nanoplastics. And how is it with textiles? I mean, it's not better, is it?
It's much worse. So what happens with so if you buy a recycled polyester garment, I would say 99 times out of 100, that's been the textile has been made from plastic bottles, and so they're taking plastic from one context and processing it into a textile, and once it's in the textile, it gets exponentially more difficult to recycle. Because if you think about it, most garments are not one material. You have buttons and you have zippers and other bits, and processing that, and then you've got all the treatments they put on it, like things to stop it from the color from fading and all that sort of stuff. And then like the sorting process of textiles and of garments is incredibly complicated and difficult. And so you're taking a plastic from one sort of context and putting it into one that makes it more difficult to recycle. And then, yeah, you're absolutely right. It all degrades down back into the earth, ends up back in the earth again anyway. I mean, for me, after doing the last example, the film one, the 100% polyester monomaterial one, I never wanted to work with that material ever again. Just from a very personal perspective, when I was making the garment, so I cut it, the fiber, the fluff, would just like float in the air, and I would blow my nose and I would have like bright yellow, purple, blue fibers in my mouth and in my nose and in my eyes. And it was just like, I don't know, just kept kind of exponentially like blowing that up, going like at a scale of the whole industry. This is extremely problematic.
Pushing to a legislation that's not possibly is going to make the problem worse.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult kind of space. 60% roughly of all the textiles that we have are made from polyester.
And so, the new technologies that you just showed, would they be applicable with some new materials? Yeah. Like I see now you can make leather from mango leaves or mushroom
exactly.
or whatever. That's the
that's where I'm really interested in looking, and also things like re-looking at the materials, natural bio-based materials that, for example, wool. If you think about some of the inherent properties of wool, is that it shrinks and it felts. We treat wool so it doesn't do that. Like we manipulate it so that it won't do that. So we can just throw it in the wash, just like everything else. But what that means is it's inherently a shape change material. Like when you mist it with water, it changes shape. Like it does a thing. And so we can either use those materials as they are, but like kind of use them for celebrate their properties that they have, use a material-driven approach to discover what else could we do with these things that are not fossil-based materials, that are cellulose-based materials, for example, does a similar thing. Linen is amazing. It changes shape when you spray it with water, or and there's like really interesting new materials like new living bacteria-based color, living color. Or more kind of at the technological end, you can process waste wool into a keratin fiber, which is shape memory. So like rather than shape memory alloy or shape memory polymer, it's like shape memory wool. And so, yeah, I think there's this sort of materials development space, but also looking at existing materials, sort of heritage materials that we have, and rethinking how we can use them, looking at also how we've developed infrastructure over time, which has been in order to produce things really fast and cheap. We need to rethink the whole, like the kind of machines we have, even like in the denim industry, replacing cotton with something like hemp, for example, which is easier to grow, uses less water, all that sort of thing, is actually kind of difficult, because the development of the technology for spinning, for processing the fiber, for weaving the textiles has been focused around cotton. And so then when you put hemp into that system, you evaluate it, comparing it to cotton, and you're like, oh, it's not as good. It doesn't end up the way that I want it. It's not as soft. But that's because the whole technology has been developed for this fiber and not this one. So I think there's sort of multi-layers of things in terms of materials, infrastructure, design process, evaluation, all that sort of thing. It's very, I don't know, lots of people looking at all these different areas. Super interesting field.
Thank you. We have another question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's me. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting, and I really like that the fundamental approach you're having, even though it's quite difficult, I guess. But I wonder, I don't know if you have any input about it, is if we would look at all the garments which are in the anthropogenic cycle, so which are in use or are in stock somewhere, so not resources, and we would speculate on how much does a person need to, like not the overconsumption we're having right now. Let's say a person would need maybe 5 pieces or 10 pieces, speculating. How long can we survive on the existing stock? And would we even need new materials? And can approaches even be to just work on existing anthropogenic stock?
Yeah, I think that's a really, I often think about that. And I agree. I think we could stop producing garments right now, and we'd probably be good for, I don't know, 50 years, maybe. I don't know how long. I don't know if anyone's actually done, the research to calculate exactly what that would be. But my suspicion is that we've got more than enough in what we have. We also have huge amounts of textile waste stockpiled, whether that's in garment form or destock rolls, and or just like rotting in landfill, for example. And I think that that needs to be that is a really important part of what needs to be done. And for me, I'm primarily interested in working with people to develop new materials from old things. So the things that we already have, rather than extracting, resources from the planet or oil or whatever, just using what we have already extracted and utilized in some way, rather than the other way. So yeah, 100% agree. We could stop right now. The industry is not going to like that, so good luck convincing them. All they want to do is grow. Like they just want to keep growing. Like it's like they have zero interest in degrowth. Not seriously, anyway. They always look at me like I'm weird when I talk about it.
Well, thank you very much, Holly. I think if there are not no questions left, then yeah, I don't think so. So yeah, I'd like to thank you for your very interesting presentation again.
Yeah,
And
no problem.
yeah, I wish you all a very nice day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. If anyone wants to get in touch with me about anything or has any further questions, send me an email. Happy to have a chat.
Great.
See you later. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.